When I was 10 years old, I killed a cat that belonged to my sisters. Why did I do this? Well, I had come to despise my sisters for various reasons. For one, it was obvious that my mother preferred them to me. My sisters were given their own bedrooms on the upper level of our house, while I was made to sleep in the basement with the rats. I mean, literally, there were rats. I would lie in the dark and be forced to listen to them squeaking and scuttering around the place. That isn't something you get used to, ever. Each night, while my sisters went up to their bedrooms, I would walk down the steps to the basement. To me, this routine became almost allegorical. While my sisters went up to heaven, I would descend into hell. While my relationship with my younger and elder sister could be considered one of love, hate, my relationship with my mother was pretty much one-way traffic. The woman despised me. There's just no other way of putting it. She and my father had gotten divorced back in 1961. My father, Ed Kemper, was a veteran of World War II and had even served as an elite paratrooper. In 1942, he married my mother, and after the war was over, he had been involved in atomic weapons testing. After leaving the military, he found work as an electrician, something that seemed to be a source of embarrassment for my mother. She never quit ridiculing Dad about his menial job. He was a hero in my eyes, but my mother never missed a chance to put the man down. He once said that taking part in suicide missions in World War II and watching atomic bombs blowing up was nothing compared to living with my mother. One day, he decided that he'd just had enough. They separated in 1957. Their divorce not being finalized until 4 years later. I desperately wanted to go live with my father. The idea of living in a house, just me and him, with no mom around to bully either of us, was almost heaven-like. In the end, the complete opposite happened. I was sent to live with my mom and sisters in Helena, Montana. Just to compound my misery, Dad went to live in California. I'd gone from living under the same roof with my best friend, my one ally, to being almost totally abandoned by him. We kept in touch over phone calls, but obviously it's just not the same. Less than a year after divorcing my dad, Mom married some guy named Norman. I'll be honest, Norman was a pretty decent guy. He did his best to bond with me, to be a father figure, even though he could never be my real dad. He taught me how to fish, and he brought me on hunting trips too. But I have something wicked to confess at this point. One day, Norman took me to visit Hauser Dam, which actually sat just a dozen miles or so from our house. While we were there, I spotted a metal bar lying on the ground. Suddenly, an idea formed in my mind. I could pick up the bar, bash Norman over the head, steal his car, and drive to California to see Dad. It was absolutely ludicrous, but still. I picked that bar up and tried to work up the guts to make the fantasy a reality. In the end, though, I couldn't go through with it. Like I said, Norman was a nice fella. My mom often pointed out that I resembled my father, and she never missed a chance to assure me that no woman anywhere would ever want anything to do with me. She was drinking real heavy at this time, and you know what they say about alcohol? How it makes good people say bad things. Well, just think what inebriation did for my mother's already sparkling personality. She would mock me endlessly about my large size. It's perhaps worth pointing out that by the age of 14, I was well over 6 feet tall. Everybody has their breaking point, and mine came one day when I was 14, and overheard my mom calling me a real weirdo to my father while they were chatting on the phone. I had to get away, and as far as I was concerned, there was only one place I wanted to go. I had to see Dad. So I hopped on a bus and made my way to Los Angeles. When I arrived at my dad's place, I discovered that he had married a German lady named Elfriede. Dad's new wife had a son from a relationship who was actually 2 years older than me. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't jealous. I didn't blame Dad for running away from Mom. I'd have done the same thing in his position. But for him to act as a father to a teenage boy that wasn't even his own blood, the sense of rejection was almost overwhelming. Fortunately for me, Dad let me stay at his place, but it wouldn't last. His new wife and I just didn't get along. I was shipped off to my grandparents' ranch. They lived on a mountaintop in the Sierra Nevada mountains. It was very secluded, and it wasn't long before boredom set in. My grandfather brought me a .22 caliber rifle and taught me how to use it. To pass the time, I'd hunt rabbits, birds, gophers, things like that. Unfortunately, my grandmother wasn't much better than my mom. While my grandfather and I got along just fine, I always got the feeling that my grandmother just didn't want me there. This was my third home in almost as many months. It seemed like anywhere I went, I'd always be an outcast. My grandmother was something of a tyrant. She wouldn't even let me bring friends home from school, not that I really had any anyways. Then my grandmother took exception to me killing animals and confiscated my rifle. I was absolutely furious. The one pastime that I actually enjoyed other than reading had been stolen from me for nothing. Hunting also satisfied a need that reading never could, in that it provided an outlet for the rage that was building up inside of me. I was 15 years old at this point in my life. So young. Too young to already be so angry at the world. Looking back now, it's clear to see that I was a time bomb, just waiting to go off. On August 27th, 1964, I finally snapped. That day, my grandfather was in town getting some groceries, and he had to make a stop at the post office too, if I remember correctly. My grandmother was sitting at the kitchen table, working on a short story for a magazine. Suddenly, out of nowhere, she accused me of looking at her funny. Maybe I was. I didn't like the woman. I suppose it's not too ridiculous to believe that I was staring at her with nothing but contempt. Either way, we got into an argument, and my grandfather wasn't there to defuse the situation. At one point, I stormed out the kitchen door and grabbed the rifle that my grandmother had confiscated. I was going to go hunting whether she liked it or not. Then, while standing just outside the kitchen window, I heard my grandmother say, "Oh, you'd better not be shooting the birds again. I had the rifle in my arms." On the other side of the screen window, I could see the back of my grandmother's head. I'd fantasized about killing her before. I raised the rifle, aiming it squarely at her head, and imagined myself pulling the trigger. Then, I turned fantasy into reality. I shot her 3 times in total. After dragging her body to one of the bedrooms, I waited for my grandfather to come home. A little while later, I heard his truck pull up, and I went out to greet him. He waved at me, and I waved back. I didn't want my grandfather to have to see what I had just done to his wife, and I didn't want him to harbor any hatred for me. So rather selfishly, I do admit, I came up behind him and shot him while he wasn't looking. In the immediate aftermath of taking my grandparents' lives, I had this incredible sensation that everybody in the towns down below me somehow knew what I had just done. If anybody had come up to that ranch just then, I would have blown them away. I'm certain that if my grandparents had lived in an urban area and not way up in the mountains, I would have become a mass murderer at 15 years of age. I had just done something crazy, but I was about to do something even more inexplicable. With both my grandparents now dead by my hand, I went inside the house, picked up the phone, and called my mother to tell her what I had done. She didn't even seem surprised. Mom told me to call the police, and so that's what I did. The cops arrived and took me in. When they asked me why I did it, I told them I just wanted to know what it felt like to kill Grandma. A psychiatrist would later say, though, that by killing my grandparents, I had avenged the rejection of both my mother and father. After being diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic, I was sent to a maximum security hospital for mentally ill convicts. But that's a story for another day.